is the Torah portion of Beshalach. The past few weeks, we're going through a story. We're going through an entire journey. The Jews are in Egypt, right? The whole book of Bereshit, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Jews are in the Holy Land. Then at the end of Bereshit, the Jews make their way down to Egypt. Till now, these past few Torah portions, we are discussing. We're talking about the Jews in Egypt. What did they go through, etc., etc. We have the 10 plagues, and it's all dragged out, and there's miracles, and there's fights, and Moses speaks to God, and all these different things. And we come to Parshas Beshalach, and it's the culmination, it's the peak of the whole story. The Jews leave Egypt. Torah portion starts off, Vayihi Beshalach Paro et ha'am. And it was when Pharaoh sent the Jews out. Finally, we made it. The Jews made it out, they were slaves, and now they're free. What was the big focus of the past Torah portions and of the entire leaving Egypt? We don't hear a lot about individual Jews, individual stories, but the main focus is through the eyes of Moshe, through the eyes of Moses. We see him go to Pharaoh and talk to him. He convinces Pharaoh, then Pharaoh changes his mind, but a lot of it is on focus on Moses. The reason for that is seemingly pretty obvious, because Moses was the leader of the Jewish people, and while the Jews obviously had their own merits and were their own people, but as Jews we know that the way to fully connect to God is through a leader. Obviously, we're not connecting to the leader, we're connecting to God. But a leader helps us. We're people who have physical needs, physical wants, physical enjoyments. And through our leader, whoever that leader is, in every generation it's different, we are able to connect to God and strengthen our connection to God. Also this week, this coming Shabbos, I'm not sure if everyone knows, is a very, very, very special day in the Chabad calendar, which is why everyone here is expected to be in Shul on Shabbos. We're going to fabring, we're going to say La L'chaim. It's a very special day. God willing. What is this day? It's the day of Yud Shvat. In 1950, on this day, 75 years ago about, the previous Chabad Rebbe passed away. And you had a large group of Chabad people, didn't know what to do with themselves. You know, most of them, throughout their entire lives, had a Rebbe. And they were lost. And they went over to the current Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, and they asked him, please, can you be our leader? And for an entire year he declined. He said, I'm not going to be a leader. The Rebbe was a known introvert. He was not interested in spending his entire life talking to people. He wanted to sit and learn all day. And 1 year from the passing of the previous Chabad Rebbe, they had a fabrengen. They had a Hasidic gathering. All the Chabad Hasidim came into 770, the headquarters of Chabad, and they had a fabrengen. And a lot of the members of Chabad, the Chassidim, believed that maybe this is the time where the Rebbe will finally take upon himself to be the leader of Chabad. So how do you know when someone becomes a Rebbe? So when they say a Chassidic discourse, which is called a mimer in Hebrew, it's a discourse that's a very deep discourse, speaks about mystical things and about God's connection to this world. That is something only said by a Rebbe. So the Chassidim are hoping that the Rebbe will say a mimer. So the Chassidim sat down, they all packed into 770, it was much smaller back then, it was barely any room to stand. And halfway through the fabrengen, one of the Chassidim stood up on the table and he screamed, he said, Rebbe, we need someone to lead us, say a mimer. And the Rebbe actually right then got very serious and started a discourse, a mimer. So a lot of people, I always tell people, wow, this is a big holiday, and a lot of people understandably are like, listen, I'm not fully Chabad, this isn't really for me. What a lot of people don't realize is that by the previous Chabad Rebbes, before 1950, Chabad wasn't the same that it is today. There wasn't the idea of a Chabad house, there wasn't an idea of shluchim, of Chabad emissaries, and that was only something that was instituted once the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the 7th Rebbe, took upon himself to be the leader. He created this idea, this concept of Chabad people going out into the world and spreading Chabad knowledge. So the Chabad Russian Center, the beautiful show we have on Sunday Isles Boulevard, would not be around today without this monumental holiday that is coming up on this Friday, on this Shabbos. So what's the connection between the two? It explains in Chassidus what's the connection between the Parsha and what is coming up on Shabbos, the Rebbe taking upon the leadership. It explains in Chassidus, in the mystics, that every leader is connected. Not just is every leader connected, but also there's a uniqueness to a 7th generation. The number 7 in Judaism is a very special number. So this is, when the Rebbe gave his first talk, this is what he spoke about. He spoke about the uniqueness of 7, which brings out the connection between Moshe and the Rebbe, and all the 7th in every generation, the leader of every 7th generation. So it says in Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, which was a book written by King Shlomo, which is a love. It's a book about love, about between a bride and a groom, a chassan and kala, and all the rabbis explain that Shir HaShirim is a metaphor for the relationship between God and the Jewish people. So what does it say in Shir HaShirim? It says, Basi legani achosi kala. It says that the groom tells his bride, I'm coming to your garden that you have prepared for me. And the rabbis explain that what's the metaphor here? That God is turning to the Jewish people. In general, the way it's explained in Judaism is that the Jews are considered the bride and God is considered the groom in our relationship. And God is coming to Jewish people and he's saying, I'm coming into this beautiful garden. What's this garden? It's this world. That our entire mission in this life is to prepare this world, to make it a garden for God. And God's telling Jews, I'm going to come into your garden, I'm going to come settle and enjoy from this world you prepared for me. So right away, a lot of the rabbis ask, and they say, it says, Basi legani, I am coming to my garden. Why does it say my garden? Obviously, everything in the world belongs to God, but God's never been here. So why does it say I'm coming to the garden? What's my garden? So the rabbis explain that my garden means that before the world was created, God dwelled here. Not only before the world was created, but at the beginning of creation, God came down into this world and he dwelled here. So what happened? We know that there's 7 levels in heaven. The highest level is where God resided before, at times that he was farthest from the Jews. It's called the 7th level. And God comes down into this world, down through all 7 levels. So when the world was created, God was down in this world. We know there was the Garden of Eden, there was Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, and the world was perfect. There was no pain, there was no suffering, and at that time God was in this world. And throughout the generations, there came along people who rebelled against God and caused pain to God, etc. And those people pushed God away. It started with Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, when she ate from the tree which she wasn't meant to. That pushed God away one level. Then it went to Cain and Abel, Cain and Abel when they fought and Cain killed his brother. Then it went to, in the next generation, was the idea of idolatry was introduced, that there's not that physical items are God. And then went from there to the building of the Tower of Babel, and all these different things throughout history that pushed God away. So God started in this world, and he got pushed away. But obviously, there's parallels both ways. The same way God was pushed away through 7 different instances, God was also brought down to this world through 7 different instances. And what were those? We go through all of the forefathers. We have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were the first 3. Then Levi, who was priesthood, he was the one after Yaakov. Then his son Kahas. Then Amram, who was, and then the last one was Moses. Moshe was the one who brought down God into this world. When it was by the time of the giving of the Torah, it's the first time God came back into this world after leaving this world by the Garden of Eden. And obviously, each one of those people had extreme significance to the process. They each were a big part of it. But what Moshe did was the most important, the biggest step, because till Moses came around, God was not in this world, and then God was in this world. So that is the biggest step.
He was, but he was not visible, right?
Cool, obviously, but when we're talking about God making his quote-unquote primary resting place in this world, that is the ultimate goal, the coming of Mashiach. Obviously, if God was completely gone from this world wouldn't exist. Actually, there's one of the original beliefs of idolatry was not that there wasn't a real God, but it says that God, it says Azav et ha'olam, that God created the world and he bounced. He said, I'll let it run itself. So obviously God's always here. But to make God his primary residence in this world, that's our goal. So that's what Moses was able to accomplish. Why was it specifically through Moshe? Why not through Avram? Avram was holy. Why not Yitzchak? Why Moshe? What was so special about Moshe? So a lot of people would say that what was so special about Moshe was that he took the Jews out of Egypt. But the rabbi says we don't count who had more. There was something unique about Moshe that nobody else had. something seemingly mundane. Moshe was the seventh. Moshe was the seventh generation. And it says in Torah, Kol hashviyim chavivin. That all of the seventh are special, are cherished. The seventh are cherished. The Rebbe says, it doesn't say Kol hachavivin shviyim, that all the ones who are cherished happen to be seven. But it says that the seven themselves are cherished. Not due to what they do or how they act, but simply for the fact that they are the seventh makes them special. So that's what was unique about Moshe. Where do we see the number 7 being so unique? You look all throughout Judaism.
Yeah.
We have Shabbat is on what day of the week? It's on the 7th day of the week. If you look when it comes to the calendar number of years, the 7th year is Shemitah. 7th year is special. Even more than that, every 7 sets of 7 years is Yovel. It's a year of resetting. So there's all these different, the 7th month of the year is, if we count it according to the Torah, which starts by Passover, is Tishrei, which has the bulk of the holidays. So 7 for itself, not for anything it's done or anything it's accomplished, but 7 has a uniqueness. That's what it explains in the Torah. But what was so unique about Moshe? What's part of being the 7th? Is that the 7th is 100% dependent on the first. If you don't have 1, you don't have 7. Right? What do we say? We're standing on the shoulders of giants. Right? We're the ones who are reaching there. We're the 7th. We're reaching to the end, but we're dependent on who we're standing on. Right? If the ladder falls, it doesn't make a difference how close you are. Right? You have to have the help from everyone else. So the Rebbe says, in order to really understand the uniqueness of being the 7th, we have to understand the uniqueness of the first. So who was Avraham? So the Rebbe delves into the mission of Avraham's life.
I'm sorry.
Yeah?
Why is the connection? Why do, in order to understand the 7th, you need to understand the first? Why not the 6th?
Because the foundation, the basis is always the most important thing. Right? Beginning and end. Obviously, everyone throughout was important and had their own uniqueness and their own contributions. But when you get to the end of something, you start to realize the importance of what started it. The start, to be able to begin something, is possibly as hard or harder than even finishing it. The first step is always the hardest. So what was so unique about Avraham? Everyone always says, what's important about being a Jewish person? You have to give up your life for God. You have to be willing to sacrifice yourself. We see that Isaac was put on the altar. He was ready to sacrifice himself physically for God. But Avram wasn't really like that. Obviously, Avram was willing to sacrifice himself. But Avram's mission in this world was not to sacrifice himself, was not to give himself up for God. But his mission was to spread God throughout the world. This is the first person who discovered God. And as we know, that Avram spent his entire life running around the world, telling everyone God is real. We know the famous story. Avram's father ran an idol shop. He sold idols. Pretty ironic.
It's a big switch.
Correct. It's a big switch. It's also a pretty stupid job, but whatever. Doesn't really make sense to us, but people were different back then.
He made his living. Like
Still big money.
Correct. Avram's father sold idols. He sold physical idols, and from time to time, he would have to leave town, whatever it was. We'd have to go, I don't know, maybe replenish the idol stock. I'm not sure how the idol business works, but he had to leave town.
Thank God.
And he would have his sons take over the shop. And one day he came to Avram and he said, Avram, you're growing up and it's very exciting. You can finally take over the shop. It's a big deal. It's a big moment. You could take over the shop. He left town. And what would Avram do? Somebody would come into the shop, whether they're 50, 60 years old, and he would ask them, he's like, how old are you? They'd say, 50 years old. And he would look at them and he'd say, you're 50 years old? And you're going to go and pray to a physical idol that was created 3 hours ago?
Such a difficult
He
age.
destroyed his father's business.
He would tell them straight up. It wasn't a complicated... He said, I mean, look, you got to be stupid. And people would walk out embarrassed. That's what Avram would do generally. We're getting there. Yeah, it's a whole build-up. It's like a climax. One day, his father left town, Tarach left town, and Avraham, a lady came into the shop, and she told Avraham, I've brought gifts for the gods. That was the custom. You would bring food and gifts for the gods. She brought a plate of flour, And she gave it to Avram. As she left the shop, what did Avram do? He took a hammer and he destroyed all the idols. He just physically smashed all the idols. And he took the hammer and he put it in the arms of the biggest idol. He didn't destroy it, he left it standing and he put it in its arms. And he left the food by the feet of the idol. His father comes back, a day, 2 hours, I don't know. He comes back when he's finished. And he comes to Avram and says, what happened? This is my whole business, my whole livelihood, everything's gone. So Avram tells him very simple. He says, this lady came in, she offered food for the gods. Obviously, I gave it to the gods because I respect them. And the gods started fighting. One started screaming, I want the food. Next started screaming. They started fighting. Everyone wanted the food. All of a sudden, the biggest idol took a hammer, destroyed all the other idols, and kept all the food for himself. So what does Avram's father respond? He has a very good answer. He says, are you stupid? So this is pieces of stone. These are pieces of garbage. Of course, they're not going to stand up and start talking and fighting with each other. So Avram smiles. It's like, exactly, I proved my point. These are hunks of wood, hunks of stone, and you're sitting and you're praying and you're dedicating your entire life to them. So this was Avram's entire life mission, was to spread the idea that whatever these people are doing is fake, is pointless, and to spread the word and the message of God. What happened? His father took him, shipped him off to the king or the leader. His name was Nimrod, and Nimrod took him, and he said, you're now living in my palace. We're going to go pray to the fire. There's a big bonfire. We're going to pray to the fire. And Avram turns to him and he says, you're going to pray to the fire? What about the rain? The rain could put out the fire. Let's pray to the rain. So he agrees. He says, valid, we'll pray to the rain. And it goes on and on. He says, why do you pray to the clouds? Because the clouds produce the rain. And he said, why don't you pray to the wind? Because the wind can blow away the clouds. Mm-hmm. And then finally he turns to him and he says, clearly the wind is the most powerful thing. And there's people here who can withstand the wind. They don't get knocked over by the wind. So we should pray to the people. Nimrod obviously didn't enjoy this. Not only was he an idol worshiper himself, he considered himself a god. The people used to pray to him. So he took Avram and he threw him into the fire. And Avram miraculously was saved. The fire moved away and there was a whole garden there for him. The point of all this story is that obviously Avram's life mission was to spread the basic idea that God was real and God was true and God was the answer. At the same time, Avram was 100% willing to sacrifice his life. But that doesn't mean that his life mission was to die for God. Avram understood that he had a different life mission than some other people. Some people, like Rabbi Akiva, I'm going to say stories on that. I'll say a quick story about Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, what was his life mission? He always prayed that one day he'd be able to sacrifice himself, his life for God. And back then, the leaders of the Romans would like to literally torture the Jews. There came a time where they were torturing Rabbi Akiva, and the time came to say Shema. And he started saying Shema and laughing. He started laughing. Yeah. While he's getting tortured, he's laughing and saying Shema. The man torturing him turns to him and says, something's wrong with you. You must be a sorcerer or something. How are you laughing while you're getting tortured? And he turned to him and he said, right now I'm saying Shema. In my entire life, if you look at the words of Shema, it says, V'yahavta es Hashem Elokacha. You should love God, your Lord. B'chol levavcha, with all your heart. B'chol nafshecha, with all of your soul. U'v'chol me'odecha, with all of your strength. And Rabbi Akiva turns to me and he says, till now, every time I said Shema, I loved God with all my heart. I loved God with all of my energy, with all of my power. But I was never able to love God with all of my essence, with all of my being. But now that I'm sitting here and you're torturing me and physically trying to hurt me because I'm a Jew, now I'm able to love God with all of my essence. Wow. So Rabbi Akiva was a different type of person. He was the type of person that his entire life mission was to physically sacrifice or give up his life for God. But the Rebbe says that that's not our mission. Our mission is like Avram. Avram's the first, we're the seventh, right? This is the seventh generation. And our mission is not to die for God, but to spread God's name. A lot of people know, but back in the 50s or even earlier, there was a big movement in the Jewish communities, in the orthodox Jewish communities, to fight against modern creations. Whether it was radio, whether it was TV, whether it was all these different things. I didn't know that. The orthodox communities, the ultra-orthodox communities, shun these ideas. And the Rebbe once gave a talk, And he said, why are we shunning these things? Why are we pushing them away? We should embrace them. The Rebbe said, everything God creates has a positive, has a purpose. Take a look at the radio, right? The radio you could listen to, you could waste your time, you could listen to non-important things, but at the same time, the Rebbe was the first person to institute a Torah class on the radio. Mm-hmm. He said, imagine this, till now you have to physically go and travel to a synagogue to hear a Torah class. Now you could turn on the radio and hear a Torah class. So Chabad in general embraces the world, and we use it for good. What was the Rebbe's basis for this thought? What was his proof? Maybe he's wrong. So the Rebbe always said like this. The Mishkan, which was the first home for God that was built. When God first came to rest in this world, after all those generations, after giving the Torah, they built something called the Mishkan. And the Jews used very special wood. It's a whole story. They dragged it all the way from Egypt. They carried it with them, made themselves crazy for this special wood. It was an acacia tree. I don't know what it is, but that's what it was.
Acacia?
Acacia. A-C-A-C.
Okay.
For the Russians. The Hebrew word is Atse Shitim. That's the Hebrew word for acacia wood, acacia wood. The source, the root of that word, Shitim, is shtus. I don't know if you know what shtus is. Shtus is stupidity.
Yeah.
So the Rebbe says,
Nonsense.
you're going to build the house of a stupid, garbage.
Nonsense.
Like a lack of substance. The Rebbe says you're going to build the house of Hashem from something that its name is rooted in nonsense and lack of substance. Doesn't make any sense. So the Rebbe says that is specifically where Hashem could dwell, where Hashem could come down and settle. What's the term? There's a term in Judaism called shtus dikdusha. Stupidity of holiness. I don't know if stupidity is the word, but frivolous holiness. The story always brought was one of the big rabbis back in the times of the Talmud had a custom that he would go to weddings, and before the bride and groom, he would sit there and juggle for them. He'd put on a show. One time, one of the rabbis nearby said, this guy's embarrassing us. We are holy rabbis, we're leaders of the generation, we sit and learn all day. And this one of our colleagues is sitting and putting on a show for a bride and groom. It's not respectful. A lot of the rabbis agree with him. And then when this rabbi passed away, it says a pillar of fire escorted him to the heavens, which was something that rarely happened. It happened to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Eliyahu Navi had something similar, but it was something that showed extreme holiness. And the rabbi explains that why was he accorded this honor of being escorted up by a pillar of fire was because of this juggling act. Because he took something which is frivolous, something which seemingly has no basis in holiness, and that's what he used to do a mitzvah. It's a big mitzvah to make a bride and groom happy by their wedding. And he used something which seemingly had no connection to God and used it to do good. And that is the hardest but the most important thing to elevate. We know that the world was created, that every single physical thing in this world has a small part of God in it. And when we use something for a good deed, for a mitzvah, whether you sit at a table and you eat kosher food, or you sit in a chair and you listen to a Torah, to thoughts on Torah, you take those sparks of God and you elevate them. So this rabbi, what was he doing? He was taking whatever objects he was using and he was elevating those sparks. And it says that when will Mashiach come? Only when we have elevated all of the sparks in the entire world and elevated them to God. It says, why were the Jews in Egypt even? Because there was sparks in Egypt. And throughout the Jews doing whatever they did throughout their time in Egypt, whether it was keeping the Jewish names, dressing appropriately, some of the Jews would sit and learn Torah, that's how they elevated all those sparks. And the Rebbe says now we're at a time, we're in the 7th generation, it says we're on the doorsteps of Mashiach. We are as close as we can possibly get. And back in Russia, you look at the Jewish communities, what they do? They had a shtetl. They would lock themselves in. They would corner themselves in. A lot of the religious Jews.
The majority did.
The religious Jews, the orthodox Jews.
Back in the day. Before the revolution.
I don't know how recently.
For sure.
Okay, so I have my own experience in it.
Well,
Everyone has their own experience, but my personal experience from the 1950s, that's how it was. Before the 1950s. I'm talking like the 20s, the 30s, pre-World War II. We're not talking about just in the past 100 years, but for hundreds and hundreds of years. Back when the Jews lived in Russia, they lived in very secluded places because they were in generations where the mission and the goal of the generation was to focus on yourself, to keep Judaism alive. But now we're at a time where that's not enough. We can't just keep Judaism alive, but we have to spread Judaism everywhere. The same way Avraham's job was to spread Judaism, that is the mission of our generation, which is why the Rebbe instituted, for the first time out of all the previous Rebbes, the Rebbe was the seventh, he instituted the idea of a Chabad shliach, an emissary. And the Rebbe said something very interesting. I don't believe it's the Rebbe's line, I believe it's been used by many different people. The Rebbe said that a real leader doesn't create followers, a real leader creates leaders. So a lot of people think that, my personal Chabad rabbi, his job is to spread God everywhere. But I'm a follower of Chabad, a follower of God, a follower of whatever. But our job is to become a leader and to spread that one step further. But not only do we have to spread God, but we have to make something called shtus diktusha. Something that looks stupid, something that looks like it can help us in our mission. Whether it's our job, whether it's our vacations, our excursions, take those quote-unquote stupidity and turn it into something positive. And only through doing all of that, we will be able to accomplish, hopefully in our days, the coming Mashiach. The whole time we're talking about Avraham compared to Moshe. Right? Avraham being the first, Moshe being the seventh. But when it comes to our lifetimes, we know that the Rebbe was the seventh, but we have to look at the first and learn from the first. So who was one of the earliest Chabad rabbis? And not just one of the earliest rabbis, but the founder of Hasidus Chabad, the Alter Rebbe. He was the one who created the entire philosophy of, well, not created, but introduced it to the world, the philosophy of Chabad, the intellectual philosophy. And they say two very good stories. First story they say, one time it was Yom Kippur, and the Alter Rebbe was in Shul, and he heard, whether someone told him or he knew from divine providence, that there was a lady who had just given birth at the edge of the woods. It was Yom Kippur, and to the shock of everyone there, the Alter Rebbe took off his talus and walked out of Shul. Imagine you're in the middle of Kol Nidre, and the rabbi walks out. He's got somewhere to be. And this wasn't just any rabbi, this was the Rebbe, the leader of the whole generation, walked out of Shul. Some of the Chassidim followed him to see what he was doing, and they watched as the Alter Rebbe walked to the edge of the woods. He took some logs, he chopped up logs for the lady, lit a fire to keep her warm.
On Yom Kippur.
And put up soup to reheat, to make sure she can eat. So I don't know if everyone knows, but according to Jewish law, a woman within the first 3 days of giving birth is considered like her life's in danger, pikuach nefesh. And you can break Shabbos if needed, only if needed. Obviously you can't break it just because you're bored, but if the situation calls for it, you are 100% allowed to break Shabbos or anything for a woman who, correct, it's saving a life if she has just given birth. Obviously this lady had nobody else to take care of her. And the Alter Rebbe took care of her and went back to Shul and finished up davening. While the story technically is allowed, the Alter Rebbe was allowed to do what he did, a lot of people were confused. The Alter Rebbe ran the entire community. He could have said to one of his helpers, hey, go take care of this lady.
Right.
Why would the Alter Rebbe in the middle of Kol Nidre stand up, leave the shul to go up? It didn't make a lot of sense. The Rebbe explains that this was the idea of shtus diktusha. Seemingly, this is the idea of a frivolous, something holy. Our job in this generation is to take the stupid things and make it holy. This was the same idea in the first generation. What's going on? The Alter Rebbe understood that there was a lady who needed help. He could have ran after somebody else. He could have done it the diplomatic way and set up a system. Somebody would go here and you'd set up a whole chain. Nowadays they set up food chains for people who give birth and they're doing a whole. The Rebbe says, there's a Jewish lady who needs help. I'm going. I'm going to go right now. I'm going to go take care of her. Even if she needs help, I'm going to help her. And it parallels the idea of our responsibility that people, what's the most common excuse? People always push things off, procrastinate, words in my mind, right?
Yeah.
People always push things off because they haven't planned it properly. I want to make sure I think it through.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I do it right. Alter Rebbe taught us when it comes to Jewish ideas, we can't push off. We can't keep saying, I'll do it later, I'll do it later. You know, people always say, you always speak to people, hey, we want to get together a group of Jews for this class or for this event, and they're like, let's wait. Let's make sure we have the right people. We can plan it properly. That is the biggest Yetzer Hara. That is the exact opposite of what's needed from us in our generation. Our job is to say, we want to do this thing that's going to make the world a better place. Let's do it right now. The Alter Rebbe taught us, if someone needs help, if there's a soul out there that's not as connected as they should be, right? It says when someone's disconnected spiritually, they're sick. If someone's sick, you drop everything you're doing and you go to take care of them. It's another quick story. It's not fully connected, but it's back in the times of, I believe, also the Alter Rebbe. There was a war. It was Napoleon and I think the Tsar.
Russians.
Make sense?
1812.
So it was Napoleon and the Tsar, and there was a massive war. Napoleon was known as the nice leader. Obviously, there was no real democracy back then, but relatively to what Russia was, it still is. And there was a whole argument in the Jewish community of how to go about it. Should we support Napoleon or support the Tsar? Almost every single leader of that generation said we're supporting Napoleon. Napoleon will give Jews freedom. Will give Jews, and the Alter Rebbe was different. The Alter Rebbe supported the Tsar. People came to him and said, "How are you supporting the Tsar? Someone who hates the Jews." The Alter Rebbe said something very simple, which sadly we can see with our own eyes. He said, "If Napoleon wins, the Jews will have better lives physically, but a direct outcome from that will be that the Jews will assimilate." Right? What causes people to unite? Tragedy, pain. And the Alter Rebbe said, I don't want the Jews to be in pain. But by default, if they're persecuted by the Tsar, it will cause them to strengthen their connection to God. I mean, you look in even more modern times. In Soviet Russia, a lot of Jews, even though they didn't practice Judaism, had this staunch connection to God. That it was a part of who they were. And when they came to America, a lot of their kids and later generations didn't have that. So how did they solve it? How did they solve the dispute? Who should the Jews support? Who's going to win the war? First of all, who won the war?
Russia.
The Tsar won the war. So what happened? The rabbis came together and they said like this: whoever was right before Rosh Hashanah, whoever will blow the shofar first.
Who?
Whichever one of the sides of the rabbis, whoever blows shofar first, then that side will win. Whether the Alter Rebbe blows it first.
Really?
This is what was decided. The Tsar will win, and if the other rabbis blow it first, the Napoleon will win. So the other rabbis, comes Rosh Hashanah. Let's say the earliest time to pray was
That was Vilna Gaon.
the Vilna Gaon. Comes Rosh Hashanah. He wakes up 6 a.m. on the dot, and he gathers 10 people. And they open their shiddur and they start davening. And he was a holy man. He used to sit and daven for hours. But he's never davened this fast. And he's flying and he's saying the words as fast as he could. And finally, he gets to the shofar blowing. And he blows the shofar. Let's say it was 9 a.m., 10 a.m. He gets word that the Alter Rebbe blew the shofar before him. So he goes to the Alter Rebbe. And he says, How? I woke up as early as possible. I said the words as fast as possible. How did you blow the shofar before me? The Alter Rebbe says, very simple. I woke up on Yom Kippur at 6 a.m. and I blew the shofar. I didn't wait for prayer. I blew the shofar. I didn't do the whole... And then I prayed afterwards. So the Vilna Gaon turns to him and he says, there's an order. There's a process. You first pray, then you blow the shofar. How could you just blow the shofar? The Alter Rebbe told him, he said, at a time like this, when Jewish lives are at risk, and this will decide the fate of the Jewish people, it's similar to the idea of shtus tiktusha, that I have to do this. It might not seem like the holiest thing to do, but you put aside your own preferences. Of course I wanted to pray long first, but I put aside my own preferences in order for the Jewish people. So the same way the first generation did these things, so too by us. We have to put aside our personal enjoyment preferences. We might not be able to stay at the synagogue and focus, right? A lot of people, you bring a friend to shul, someone who's never been, you can't daven the same because they're sitting next to you and they want to talk and they want to... But we have to put aside our personal preferences and realize that our job is to connect as many Jews to Hashem. Even if that might take away from our personal enjoyment, that's the mission of our generation.